When we left off your last class, we're going over why the United States got involved in World War One. That is, you had a public that was hostile to the idea of the war that grew into it because, especially people at the top in America, had an idea that this was a war of good guys against bad guys, and the events of the war and their own kind of preconceptions about what Germany and Britain were led them to that conclusion. Now that they're in the war, we want to look at what the war is going to do to the United States. And the number one thing the war meant to the United States was money. Because the United States didn't actually get involved in the war until fairly late in 1917. The war had already been going on for 3 years by that point. And during those 3 years, before there was even an American soldier in the war, both sides, and then especially the Allied side, the Triple Entente side, England and France, were buying heavily American products, which meant that a lot of money was coming to America. When the war started in August of 1914, the United States was actually in a recession. And however, all of the war products that got sent to Europe winds up creating an economic boom in the United States. Economic historians compare the era of World War One most closely to the era of the gold rush in the 1800s. As in 1848, they found gold in California, flooded America with money. You had basically a similar thing happening in 1914. And in 1914, 15, 16, you saw this money going everywhere because the British, the French, their allies were buying food. They were buying cotton. They were buying clothing. They were buying ammunition. They were buying anything that could be manufactured. So you saw this tremendous economic boom in the United States, a boom that actually got bigger when America winds up entering the war as a belligerent. That is, once America was now fighting the war, the U.S. government is going to spend 32, what was the number? I believe it was $32 billion fighting World War One. That was in 1917 money. That was 52% of the gross national product of the United States. The equivalent of that in today's money would be about 10 trillion, right? And that would be dumped on the United States over the course of a couple of years. So you see this tremendous state of economic growth as the war is going on. And while the war is going on, that is after 1917, when America is now involved in the war, as far as sending troops, demands on the economy became so great that the powers of the US government were radically enlarged in order to handle it. The man you're looking at on the screen right now is a man named Bernard Baruch. He was a financier that was associated with the Democratic Party. Woodrow Wilson was the president. He was a member of that party. During the war, Baruch here became part of something called the War Industries Board. That is, the uh, Congress created the War Industries Board to coordinate the entire civilian economy of the United States. So if you owned a business, you had to report to the War Industries Board. The War Industries Board allocated resources. The War Industries Board also set prices. That is, they had a price control commission that could determine what the price of any product would be. The War Industries Board had within it something called the U.S. Railroad Administration. The Railroad Administration nationalized the railroads of the country. That is, as war production got really ramped up after 1917, war materials clogged every railroad in the country. Factories found that they couldn't operate because they couldn't get supplies. So the government responded to that by taking all the private railroads and putting them under the control of the government. Okay. The Secretary of the Treasury, a man named William McAdoo from Texas, was put in charge of the railroads, and the government would continue to operate the railroads until 1919. By the way, the administration of the economy during World War One actually worked pretty well. Industrial production under the War Industries Board increased about 20% in 1918 and 19. The railroads were actually ran better and more efficiently under the government than they were when they were under private hands, when you had a bunch of separate private companies owning individual railroads. The government standardized the railroads, made them all use the same equipment, and had one common schedule that ran the entire country rather than a bunch of private companies having their own schedules. Uh, During the war itself, this these types of government activities did not really were seen as patriotic measures, but were seen as temporary. You also saw similar measures being done in food. The United States rationed food during the war, and all food production was put under the control of a government agency called the Food Administration. Energy was put under the control of a government agency called the Fuel Administration. These things were seen as patriotic war measures while the war was going on, but there was not a whole lot of support, either from President Wilson or from the broader public, to make these things permanent. So once the war was over, things went back to normal. However, the administration of the economy by the government was something that influenced a lot of people in the long run. That is, it made the idea of a government planned economy look practical and look like a good idea to a lot of people. Right? So a lot of what these guys were doing in World War One were going to become a model for what the New Deal is going to do in the 1930s. We'll get to that later, and a model for what President Roosevelt is going to do during the Second World War. We'll get to that later as well, and also among a part of the American public and indeed the worldwide public, because the rest of the world were doing similar things. It made the idea that private businesses were a thing of the past and rational planning under government control was a thing of the future, a much more popular idea. And we'll get into the implications of that in a future class. So you have the economy rapidly expanding. The economy is getting a much more direction as a result. And the economy is also creating great labor shortages. By the way, it for some reason this slide keeps showing the statement "What is fascism?" That comes from another class. However, it got stamped on this slide, and I don't know how to get rid of it. So bear with me on this. But what you're seeing here is a map about the movement of people, and let me explain what's going on here. As the war went on, and as the civilian economy boomed as a result of war production, you got wound up getting a great shortage of labor in the factories of America. Unemployment by 1915 was down to 1.5% in the United States. That basically means that everybody who was looking for a job had one. So if you were owning a factory, you had to find somebody to come in and work in that factory. In the United States, that did not mean during World War One the great introduction of women into the workforce. You saw some of that, but not much, not nearly as much as you would see in World War II, something we'll get to in a future class. In Britain, you saw a large number of women involved in the workforce, but not nearly so much in America. In America, instead, what you saw was the great movement of rural people into the cities to work in these factories because now they have great demands for labor. And with the war going on, immigrants from Europe can't come in and work in American factories either. So you saw rural people from places like Kansas, places like the Dakotas, places like West Virginia, the Appalachian Mountains, leaving their traditional farm lives and coming into the cities to work in factories. In the factory towns, they especially called the Appalachian people who came in hillbillies, and that they were, I guess, targets of scorn and ridicule to some extent. But they wind up living entirely new lives. Instead of being kind of rural small farmers, they were now urban workers. You also saw the same thing happening from the southern states. From the southern states, you had white farmers leaving traditional farms to come north. You also saw black farmers doing it. Remember, the typical black person was a sharecropper. That was somebody who did not own their own land. They worked somebody else's land in return for, uh, and they gave them a percentage of the crop as rent. Remember, these people did not really make any money because, in addition to that, they also had to pay for food, which wound up coming out of the other part of their crop. You would see sharecroppers who essentially would get paid zero for working in the fields 300 days a year. Also, when you get into the 1890s and early 1900s, you saw a great wave of racism in the southern states. that led to the creation of segregation laws, which limited the movement of black citizens. You also saw blacks removed entirely of the right to vote in the southern states, something that would not come back until you get into the 40s and 50s. So if you were black, life in the South was pretty bad economically and otherwise. So now that there are jobs available in the northern cities, people started leaving their homes, moved north, and started working there. In Black history, they call this the Great Migration. That is the great movement of Black people from the traditional places in the southern states into the new cities of the North and the Midwest in California. 90% of the black population lived in the southern states and was involved in agriculture in 1900. Today, a euphemism for black people is the urban market. That is, when people think of African Americans, they think of cities. And World War I was really the starting point in this. It started the ball rolling, and once you got black populations in the cities, they brought their relatives, and you wind up with a flow of people that would continue really throughout the rest of the 20th century. And you saw from the southern states also white people doing the same thing. That is, if you were a small white farmer, your economy was declining ever since the Civil War. That is, you saw your ability to make a living get worse and worse. Uh, and if you were, and increasingly, small southern farmers were losing their land too. They were becoming sharecroppers. So a number of them said, "Screw this." They packed up and moved into the northern cities as well. So you saw the great labor shortages that was driven by this booming war economy that were driving rural people away from the country and into the cities, something that is going to have a huge impact on the 20th century. You also saw, as a result of these labor shortages, a revival of organized labor in America. That is, America never really had much of a tradition of unions. In Europe, unions were part of the old medieval guild tradition. That is, skilled workers in towns would band together in order to control wages, in order to control work. In America, you had that to a certain extent in the 19th century. But the development of the big industries of the 1800s basically destroyed that. That is, companies like Carnegie Steel, Standard Oil did not want to have anything to do with unions. So if they had unions in their factories, they tried to destroy them. The climax of this was in the 1890s. In the 1890s, Carnegie Steel announced that it was going to cut wages during a recession in 1893 called the Panic of 1893. The workers at the Homestead Steel Mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania went on strike as a result. Carnegie Steel crushed the strike, and unions in the steel industry were essentially destroyed. Right? World War One, though, changed this because now you had great labor shortages. These great labor shortages gave bargaining power to the workers themselves. Workers would quit their jobs and go someplace else. And also, because you have a booming economy, you also see a wave of inflation. Prices of everything are going up. So, workers with power who now see the money going out of their pockets are demanding higher wages in order to meet their higher prices. And if the companies don't give it to them, they go on strike. You see a wave of spontaneous strikes throughout the American economy, and you see a revival of unions during the war, right? Which is going to continue for the duration of the war, but ultimately, for reasons we should go into later, these unions are going to wind up being taken down. But so what you get during the war is you get a booming economy, you get higher wages, you get labor shortages, you get the great movements of people in order to take advantage of these opportunities. We see the revival of ideas like organized labor in order to take advantage of these opportunities. But the bigger issues that you're going to see during the war have more to do with ideas than money. Right? And let me give you a little background on this. Remember, the United States public did not want to get involved in this war in the first place. Right? Their leadership was driving them in that direction. But the war did not really have that great an amount of popular support. When President Wilson asked for a declaration of war on Germany, the country rallied behind him because the country rallies behind the leaders when times are hard, when the country is in danger. But the government was afraid that this wouldn't last, that without an emotional commitment to the war, as soon as people started getting killed, when there were shortages in the country, when times got hard, then people would turn on the war and turn on the government. So the government, as a result, put a great amount of effort into controlling what the public heard about the war. That is, they concluded that if they could control the flow of information, they could use this to manufacture emotional support for the war. And in order to do this, the United States created a legal foundation to control the flow of information. The government in 1917 passed two laws. The Sedition Act, they passed a law called the Sedition Act. What the Sedition Act did was it made it illegal to criticize the government or armed forces of the United States. So if you were somebody who said the war was a bad idea, they just arrest your ass and send you to jail. Right? You could say that this is something that violates the First Amendment of the Constitution, because the First Amendment guarantees free speech. Turns out, no, it doesn't. This was something that the Supreme Court decided in 1917 itself. It did it in a case called Schenck versus the United States. Schenck was a socialist. He opposed the war. So he handed out pamphlets to people telling them not to register for conscription, register for the draft to go fight in the war. So the government arrested him for violating the Sedition Act, okay, for passing out these pamphlets. He argued that this was free speech. That is, he was just on these pamphlets stating his opinion. He wasn't pointing a gun at anybody's head. The Supreme Court, however, ruled that what he did was illegal. It did it by saying that although he wasn't forcing anybody to violate the draft, there was a clear and present danger that somebody would read one of his pamphlets and refuse to register for the draft. And because of this, the Supreme Court held that the government could arrest him and not violate the First Amendment. A justice on the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, said that he compared this to yelling fire in a crowded theater. That is, you have a right to free speech, but that right to free speech does not extend to the destruction of people. Right? Speech may be free, but action is not. And if there's a clear and present danger that action will occur, that then the government could come in and stop it. Subsequent court decisions 50 years later are going to kind of reverse this, are going to make it harder for the governments to put restrictions on speech. But during the war, the government had this authority and they used it. They used it for things great and trivial. For example, in California, there was a guy who was just driving around and saw a bunch of recruits out in a field with their hair shaved off trying to exercise. So the guy stopped his car and laughed at him. They arrested him for sedition and wound up sending the guy to jail. More bigger ideas than that, there was a guy named Eugene Debs. He was another socialist. He was somebody who was a labor organizer, organized a lot of unions in the 1890s. And he was arrested along with several hundred other people for violating the Sedition Act, for publicly opposing the war. In 1920, Eugene Debs decided to run for president, and he wound up getting 1 million votes, 5% of the total popular vote in his campaign for president. He got these votes while he was still in jail for sedition. So the government is trying to basically manufacture a consensus behind the war to try to get people emotionally committed to the war. Partially, they're doing this by making any kind of a counter message, anything that might be said that would go the other direction, making sure it wouldn't be heard. But their stronger way of building support was by giving a message to the people. Right? In order to do that, the government created something called the Committee on Public Information. Through the Committee on Public Information, the government basically controlled what you heard. Right? Because if you published a newspaper in the United States during World War I, There was wartime censorship. You had to approve your copy by sending it to the Committee on Public Information first. If you filmed a movie during World War One, you had to get your script approved by the Committee on Public Information, and the Committee on Public Information had to approve your film before they would allow it to be distributed. Right? So all public information in the country essentially had to be approved by the government first. The government put George Creel, a movie producer, in charge of it. And the dominant theme that the Committee on Public Information wanted people to hear was the idea of 100% Americanism. That's one of the terms on your list. The idea goes like this: the country's in trouble, so everyone needs to be 100% American, which means they have to be 100% behind the war. And anybody who isn't 100% behind the war is a traitor who hates America, right? And if you were living in the United States in 1917, 18, you heard this every day. You saw it in your newspapers, you saw it in the movies. If you went to, say, live shows, there were a lot of them back then, every show started with a group of people called the Four Minute Men. These were kind of patriotic cheerleader types who would come up, stand up in the theater before the show started and said, "We are the 4 Minute Men. We want 4 minutes of your time," where they would give you a patriotic pep rally about how great the war was and how you had to be 100% behind it. This program worked. It built up a national euphoria behind the war. That is, it created an emotional commitment of the United States to the war effort. But it also had a lot of unintended consequences. And these unintended consequences are really going to shape the country that's going to emerge after the war in the 1920s. Let's start by looking at how kind of thick they laid this on. That is, here you're seeing one example of the message the United States is trying to send. This is a poster to join the army. And let's look at the kind of look at the image here. In the background, you see destroyed Europe. Here it says America. And in the middle, you see this ape. The ape is wearing a German army helmet. If you've ever seen the Wonder Woman movie, the German soldiers in that movie were wearing the same helmet with the spike on top. He is carrying a bloody club that says culture on it, written in German, and he's raping a white woman. In this case, liberty. Right? With the caption saying, "Destroy this mad brute." Imagine hearing this every day. That is, that every day you were seeing a story about how these barbarians across the sea are destroying everything. How America is surrounded by enemies. And you have to unite to destroy the enemies before they destroy you. Right? This creates a psychology which is very jumpy and is going to lead to a number of different consequences. One consequence it leads to is to the creation of a group called the Ku Klux Klan. And let me give you a little background on that. In Reconstruction, there was a group called the Ku Klux Klan. This was in the 1860s. These were a terrorist organization that founded in the southern states. It was created by a Civil War general from Tennessee. Right? They basically existed to terrorize black people who tried to vote or to terrorize Republican political organizations in the southern states. The Ku Klux Klan basically disappeared in the 1870s. Fast forward to 1914. In 1914, a movie producer named Cecil B. DeMille decides he is going to make the first great epic film. Right? Up till this point, movies were just a new technology. They'd been around for about 20 years. And if you'd have seen a movie, it was a lot like looking at a clip on YouTube about 5, 10 years ago. That is, you saw a lot of 2, 3, 5 minute clips that would show, and then you'd walk out and then you'd pay for another one. What DeMille wanted to do was to make the movies into a much more elaborate art form. Right? So he was going to spend a lot of money to make a spectacular movie. He called it The Birth of a Nation. Whereas movies in the past for like 5 minute clips, this movie was going to be 3 hours long. The theme of Birth of a Nation, the plot of the movie, was the story about how the heroic Ku Klux Klan saved the South from the horror of Negro rule during Reconstruction. That is, the United States was a very racist place 100 years ago. Right? This movie was spectacularly successful. Right? Apparently, President Wilson, who was a Southerner, he was born in Virginia and grew up in Georgia, watched the movie in the White House with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He called it history written with lightning. The movie was so successful that a salesman from Atlanta, Georgia, his name is William Joseph Simmons, you can see him here in the dark hood, decided that he was going to recreate the Ku Klux Klan. He just kind of did it as a goof to rip people off. That is, he was going to create a Ku Klux Klan, and he would put out ads in newspapers where you could send him money, and then he would mail you back a Ku Klux kit. So you would get a box that would have your robe, your hood, and a membership card with your rank on it. His hook was he would have all of his ranks start with K. You would start out as a cadet, and you would work your way up to Kleagle. Simmons found that he hit a gold mine. Why he hit a gold mine was once people started getting these kits and started forming their own local chapters of the Ku Klux Klan, they made the Ku Klux Klan the defenders of 100% Americanism. That is, if you were a member of the Klan, you were fighting the enemies of America in your town. Who were the enemies of America? Black people, Jews, Catholics, and women who wore pants. They really didn't like women who wore pants. And so the Ku Klux Klan became kind of a national phenomenon. And this whole idea that people could take into their own hands of deciding who the enemies of America are and to crush all those that are against 100% Americanism took off. So you saw groups like the Klan starting a wave of race riots throughout the country. Remember, you had black people moving into new northern cities. So if you were white living in one of those northern cities and you didn't like black people around, they were now not 100% American. So you and your friends could get together and destroy their houses. This is actually what these people in this photograph are doing. This was a race riot in the city of Chicago in 1919, I believe. That is you had gangs of white people going into new black neighborhoods, massacring the people, setting the places on fire. You saw black soldiers actually lynched in uniform in 1918 and 1919. Probably the biggest of these riots was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where in 1920, no, it's 1921, local white people attacked the black part of Tulsa. They even rented an airplane to bomb the black part of Tulsa. They wound up destroying the entire business district. So you see 100% Americanism being used as basically an excuse to settle old scores, to do things like launch a wave of race riots. You also saw that you also saw 100% Americanism wind up going off in other directions. One of the things it led to was a great fear of ideas that could be considered foreign or un American. Remember, you see this great movement of organized labor. At the end of the war, there was a communist revolution in Russia, creating a new nation, the Soviet Union, whose official doctrine was socialism. That is, that there should be no private ownership of property. This was seen as not 100% American. So throughout the country in 1918 and 19, there was a massive movement against these types of ideas. That is, if you were a socialist, if you were considered a communist, you would be rounded up and driven out of society. For example, there was a socialist party in the United States prior to World War One. Socialists got 20% of the vote in the governor's elections in Oklahoma in 1912. You had socialists who were members of city councils and state legislatures throughout the country. You saw them purged from public life in 1918 and 19. That is, this picture here was five socialists who were in the New York legislature. They had won their elections to serve in the legislature. The rest of the legislature just kicked them out because they were socialists. They call this period the Red Scare, which is any type of radical political idea was now seen as hostile to America. And this kind of wave continued even after the formal war was over. Right? So you see, as a result of this kind of public relations campaign for the war, uh, the idea of 100% Americanism building up ahead of steam under him. It's leading to racial unrest. It's leading towards political groups like that are considered radical being driven out. Which also, by the way, is one of the things that leads to organized labor declining at the end of the war. That is, organized labor itself was seen as politically radical. It was seen as associated with communism or socialism, so these unions were crushed by businesses by 1918 and 1919 in a series of spectacular strikes. Actually, this also wound up turning against the government by the time you get to 1919. The government itself was seen as not 100% American. So the government that was in charge under Woodrow Wilson became increasingly unpopular. It wound up being driven from office and defeated by a new president who says he's going to return the country to normalcy. That is, and all these types of efforts to try to reform the country. And also, people who are not from America were seen as not 100% American. And you can see this going on during the war itself. That is, during the war, you now see Germans, especially, being seen as enemies of the country, and really anything foreign being seen as enemies of the country. So while the war is going on, uh, anything that was German was suppressed, right? Which was actually a radical change of American culture. That is, if you go to places like Indiana, Ohio, Illinois today, driving through them is like the most boring place in the country. That is, you don't really see a whole lot of anything. However, if you would have gone there in 1914, if you'd have traveled through Ohio or Indiana in the fall, you'd have seen that they had Oktoberfests. That is, you saw a lot of remnants of European culture. People spoke European languages, such as German. You saw a lot of people traveling back and forth to visit relatives in the old country. All that, however, was suppressed during the war. That is, while the war was going on, any use of German was now not made illegal, but was made uh, unable to be done because an angry mob would turn on you. People caught speaking German in the streets got the hell beat out of them. Place names that were made that were had foreign names were renamed. For example, you saw a town in Canada. You saw similar things going on in America called New Berlin. New Berlin got renamed Kitchener after the commander of the British Army in 1915. And you saw similar things like that going on in America. While the war was going on, Frankfurters became hot dogs. Right? They started to call sauerkraut victory cabbage. Right? The Dachshund, there's a little wiener dog, which, by the way, is German for German dog, Deutsch Hund, became a victory pup. Right? There was a Lutheran minister in Minnesota who gave the last rites to one of his parishioners in German. An angry mob came by and beat the hell out of him and drove him out of town. And this continued after the war as well. That is, once these European kind of cultural artifacts were driven out, they would never really come back. So you wind up with a really homogenized culture after the war is over. And you also saw this turning on immigrants because anybody who was not from America, any European immigrant, now started to be seen as this entire pool of things that were not 100% American, were a threat to the nation. They were an enemy of the country. They were bringing in all of these radical ideas. Right? And this leads after the war to the first real large scale restrictions on immigration because the immigrants themselves were not 100% American. They were the people who were bringing in communism, who were bringing in radicalism. who were destroying the fabric of the country. Remember, you had seen nativists pushing out those kinds of ideas before the war. However, the war gave the popular push necessary in order to get this over the goal line. So after the war is over, you see a bunch of laws passed to restrict immigration, climaxing in the National Origins Quota Act of 1924. This law set a quota of how many people that any nation could send to the United States. And the quota was based off of the 1890 census. That is, they said that immigration could only come in the proportions of the American population in 1890, which meant that most of the new immigrants, people from Italy, Eastern Europe, Jews, would not be allowed into the United States, and the overall limit of immigrants would be far lower than what you'd have seen in the past. So, from World War One, as a result of the kind of these cultural ideas, this whole 100% Americanism concept, you're seeing a really changed America coming into the 1920s. Okay, one that is going to be a different place. Right? And you're also going to see some one other thing coming out of the war, which I forgot to put in a picture for, and that is one of the big political issues of the 1920s: prohibition. There had been a movement against alcohol, which had been going on for a generation or two before World War One, much like the nativist movement against immigration. However, it could never really get enough support to ban the sale of alcohol. By the way, this was also caught up in the entire women's suffrage movement. That is, a lot of the women who wanted the right to vote also were people who supported making alcohol illegal, which meant that liquor companies put a lot of money into making sure that women didn't get the right to vote. However, during the war, you have a lot of shortages of food products. There is rationing of everything. So, is in order to preserve grain for people to eat, the idea that you should not use that grain to make alcohol started to pick up steam. So, by the end of the war, you see the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution passed, which outlawed the sale of alcohol in the United States. And within a few months of the 18th Amendment finally coming in, you see the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote as well. That is, once the issue of prohibition is out of the way, then there's nothing really stopping women's suffrage anymore. So you see a bunch of social cultural changes the United States generated from the war that are going to basically be working their way through the culture for the next 10, 20 years. And you see one more big thing that you get as a result of the war. You get one of the biggest pandemics in the history of the world, the great influenza pandemic of 1918. Something which you're probably hearing a lot about in the news because of our current pandemic. Right? The difference between 1918 and today, with what we got today with the coronavirus, is that the influenza pandemic was actually driven by the war. That is, the human events that were going on in 1918 were why they had this pandemic in the first place. And let me give you a little bit of the story about it. I, you saw this influenza hit the world in two waves. There was a first wave that occurred in the spring of 1918, and then a bigger wave that occurred during the fall. Actually, what they project is that's the same thing that's going to happen to the coronavirus. We're seeing the current spring wave happening now. They figure it'll die down in the summer and then come back with a vengeance in the fall. Right? This is normally, by the way, how influenza operates. 40 million people a year in the United States catch influenza. And most of the hospital capability in the United States is used in order to deal with influenza. Right? However, the war made this influenza outbreak worse. Partially, it did this by limiting the amount of food available to common people. That is, there was food rationing throughout the world as a result of the war. So there was a great deal of malnutrition. Malnutrition varied according to where you were. Some places were worse than others. But lack of a proper diet was something that was fairly common in 1918. But the bigger issue that the world had in 1918 that made this influenza much worse than normal was the militaries of the world. And let me go into how this is going to work. Okay. Say we have two people, right? Jack and Jill. Jack, they both catch the influenza. Jack catches a very serious strain of the influenza. That is, the influenza is bad enough that he's sick as a dog. Jill catches a minor strain of the influenza. And by the way, this is how most viruses work. That is, viruses are easy to mutate. So when you have a virus, you'll wind up with a lot of different variants of it. Some are going to be more serious than others, right? So Jack catches the very serious strain. So what's going to happen to him? Well, under normal circumstances, he's going to get sick, he's going to go to bed, and he isn't going to leave the house. Or maybe they send him to a hospital and he's going to be stuck in a ward. Jill, on the other hand, has a very minor strain of the flu. So what's going to happen to her? Well, normally she's going to wind up going to work, right? Or go to school. Like, how many of you have done the same thing? That is, you had the flu, it wasn't that bad, so you went to work anyway. Because after all, you don't have sick days on your job, or you don't have health insurance, or you want your perfect attendance card in school. Right? Which means that under normal circumstances, sociology is going to make the mild strains of the flu spread faster than the harsh strains of the flu. That is, the harsh strains of the flus are automatically socially distant. That is, if you have them, you're not going to move around. The mild strains of the flu are, however, going to spread very quickly. A virus, usually, once you wind up catching it, is going to trigger your immune system so that if another virus that is very close to it winds up coming to you, you won't get sick, right? So sociology is going to mean that the mild strains of the flus are going to spread faster. They are going to then immunize the population so that they won't catch the more slower spreading serious strains of the flu. Right? So a typical flu epidemic will make a lot of people sick, but won't kill many people. But the war turns all of this backwards. Because let's say you take Jack and Jill and you put them in the army. Right? Private Jill gets a mild strain of the flu. So she goes to her sergeant, says, "Sergeant, I'm not feeling good." The sergeant will say, "Shut up and get back to work." So she will pick up her rifle, go back to the trench. Okay? However, Private Jack is sick as a dog. He can't even hold up his rifle. So the sergeant is going to say, "Get this guy out of my trench." They're going to put him on a stretcher and take him to an aid station, which, being the Army, means he's going to sit there in that aid station for hours before somebody deals with him. And while he's sitting at that aid station, he's going to come in contact with wounded people that are coming in from all over the line and for the medical personnel who work in the aid station. After several hours of lying there, they're going to take Private Jack and they're going to put him on a hospital train to send him to a hospital somewhere. Being the Army, this hospital train is going to take its time getting anywhere. So he's going to be spending several hours, maybe even a day on this hospital train, where he's going to come into contact with wounded from all over the line. He's going to come into contact with medical personnel. He's going to come in contact with people who work on the railroad. These guys are all going to leave that train and go back to their homes. Right? Eventually, he's going to wind up coming into a hospital. Being the Army, that means they're going to put him in an overcrowded ward where everybody in the ward, right, that is all the other wounded, all the hospital personnel, are going to come in contact with the strain of the flu, which means that during a war, the harsh strain of the flu is going to spread faster than the mild strain of the flu. It's the mild strain of the flu that's essentially socially isolated, whereas the harsh strain of the flu is going to spread to everybody. Once you catch the flu, you're not showing symptoms. You could get put on a troop train being sent to another part of the front. You could be on a ship, you get sent home. Right? So this influenza will spread rapidly. Right? We're really not sure where the where this first outbreak of this came from, but the best guess is it actually came from an army camp in Kansas. right? That is, once it winds up getting in the army, it just winds up spreading everywhere, right? And the ability of the country to deal with the epidemic was also limited by the propaganda campaign of the war. That is, remember, people are being told to be 100% American, to be 100% behind the war effort. Saying anything negative is not 100% American, right? And the media was censored also. So all over the world, nations involved in the war censored all reporting of the epidemic. So people were not told what to do. They were not warned of the epidemic. Right? The only nations that weren't involved in the war reported on it. So when the epidemic got to Spain, Spain was not involved in the war, so Spanish newspapers talked about it. So the Europeans all called it the Spanish flu to blame them for it. Right? Anyway, so you have a media that isn't going to say anything unpatriotic, like there's an epidemic going on. So the public, once the epidemic comes in, are not being warned over how to act as a result. The worst of this was in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, in the fall of 1918, they were going to hold a victory parade because the war was coming to a close. Doctors were already seeing uh, epidemic patients of the Spanish flu showing up in their hospitals. They said, you got to call off this parade because if you hold this parade, this epidemic is going to spread everywhere. Newspaper reporters interviewed the doctors and told their editors about this. The editors all suppressed in Philadelphia all suppressed all these stories because they said it's not patriotic to talk about this kind of stuff. So Philadelphia held the parade. 100 soldiers came back from Europe. They were all infected with the Spanish flu. They all marched in the parade. Within a week, Philadelphia was swept with a massive epidemic. And for that week, the newspapers still wouldn't talk about it because it was not 100% American to say anything bad about America. And so the epidemic wound up sweeping the country and it swept the world. Before it was done, it wound up killing 650,000 Americans, which was 6 times more people than World War I did. In World War I, only 117,000 military personnel died. 650,000 people died as a result of the Spanish flu. By the way, a quarter of the military casualties were also fluke victims. In the world in general, 1 out of every 3 people, before it was all done, caught the Spanish flu, and we still don't know today how many of them died. The closest estimate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million. Contrast that to war casualties. 19 million people died of all causes during World War One. More than 2 times that died of the flu. And okay, you still saw legacies of the flu for a generation afterwards. That is, once people caught this virus, the virus didn't actually go away; it just went dormant. And where it went dormant was in the brain. So in the 1950s, you saw flu survivors of the 1919 epidemic wound up getting dementia because the virus became active and basically turned their brains into guacamole. My dad was going to medical school in India in the 1950s, and he saw wards full of these types of flu survivors who came back in and were all of a sudden uh, not functional anymore. I think that's one of the things that made my dad a psychiatrist because he saw all this dementia and wanted to do something about it. Right? And the worst hit, by the way, of the influenza pandemic were Native Americans and Pacific Islanders. That is, you can see this as kind of the last act of, if you took me for History 1301, the Columbian Exchange. That is, in the old world, you saw people naturally selected to survive epidemic diseases. You didn't need to see the same pressures among Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere or among peoples in the Pacific Islands, isolated parts of Africa, so on and so forth. The influenza basically worked the same way that earlier diseases like smallpox did. When it hit an Indian reservation, it just wiped people out. And actually, that's one of the things they're looking at currently with the coronavirus. That is, they figure that the people who are going to be hardest hit by this is if the virus winds up getting to Indian reservations, those guys are going to get hit very hard. Anyway, so you saw the country being fundamentally changed as a result of this war. That is, you see a culture that is going to be radically different coming out of the war than when it came in. And just for, and so now let's just kind of wrap up the war. That is, most of the discussion we had about the war was a stalemate. In 1918, both sides made final attempts to try to break the stalemate. Right? Well, actually, let me back up a little bit. The United States got involved in the war after the Germans restarted their use of submarines in the spring of 1917. The Germans did this as a gamble. They were hoping that their submarines could sink enough ships coming into places like England and France that they could starve the English and the French out of the war. Remember, they were running a strategy of attrition. If they could keep the enemy from having enough men, having enough equipment, having enough supplies, they could force them to get out of the war. This plan almost worked in 1917. That is, the English government concluded in the summer of 1917 that because of submarine losses, they had 6 weeks worth of food left in the country. However, the English and the Americans at that point came up with a solution. The solution was something called the convoy system. That is, previously they had been having ships sailing alone across the Atlantic. So if a civilian ship ran into a submarine, it was toast. However, what they started to do in 1917 was they would tell civilian ships to meet at points off the coast of the United States. Once you had enough of them, then American or British military ships would escort those convoys of civilian ships across the Atlantic. So if a submarine attacked them, the military ships could sink them, could sink the submarines. This enabled the supplies to get back across the Atlantic, turned the entire supply situation around. And the German submarines after that basically got hunted into extinction. Fast forward to 1918. The Germans in the summer of 1918 tried one last gasp to try to win the war. Right? It involved taking some of their soldiers and retraining them. Right? That is, previously they had been trained to fight like Napoleon, stand up in a straight line, go at their enemy, kill all the enemies in front of them, and then keep on moving. The German high command, however, had specially trained soldiers trying to fight in a new way. They called them stormtroopers. The stormtroopers were told, when you attack, rather than going straight at the enemy, try to get around the enemy, flow through the enemy like water. If you can get through their lines, you can emerge on the other side of them and you've cut off your enemies. You're now in the rear of the enemy. You can go in, you can destroy their supplies, kill their commanders, and the enemy's armies over here at the front will fall apart. So the Germans launched this attack with these stormtroopers in the summer of 1918. And as you can see, for the first time, they moved the lines in 3.5 years. That is, this dotted purple line was as far as they got. However, the attack was not able to go any further, right? Because it ran into a couple of problems. One problem was the flu. That is, Germans during the spring of 1918 had suffered enough from the flu epidemic that was going on, that their guys were sick and their guys were tired. So they could not keep the offensive going fast enough. A second thing that wound up slowing them down was the English and the French were following the same strategy of attrition, that they had cut off Germany from foreign supplies, which meant that the German army by 1918 was short of food. So when German soldiers crashed through the enemy lines, once they got into the rear of the British and the French armies, they wind up running into fully stocked kitchens. So they stopped the offensive to eat. Right? That slowed them down long enough that it let the English and the French regroup. The third major problem they had was that they just didn't bring enough firepower with them. That is, these were men on foot that were trying to break through an enemy. All they could carry were things like rifles. So the farther they got from their artillery, the less firepower they were carrying. So as a result of this, by the time you get to August, September of 1918, the attack has petered out. And then England, France, and the United States started a counteroffensive. This counteroffensive, by the time you get to November, had pushed the Germans back out of most of occupied France. The counteroffensive worked because the British, the French, and the Americans started to use what would eventually be called in the American Army maneuver warfare. Right? That is, much like the Germans did with the stormtroopers, rather than going straight at the enemy, they tried to emphasize movement. That is, look for weak spots in the enemy formation and go through them rather than going straight at enemy soldiers. Right? Also, they tried to emphasize surprise. Previously, before they attacked, artillery guns would spend a day shelling the enemy before the infantrymen went forward. That gave the enemy warning about where they were going to attack. So they started to give much shorter artillery barrages. So they started to catch the Germans by surprise. Also, they were able to bring greater amounts of firepower with them. One thing that enabled them to do that was a new British invention called the tank. That is, they put an internal combustion engine in an armored vehicle and put machine guns on it. This enabled attacking soldiers to bring greater amounts of firepower with them. Right? They coordinated this with light artillery that was able to be towed by motor vehicles. Right? And they were giving infantrymen more powerful weapons as well. In the United States, the great innovation that went with this was something called the Browning automatic rifle, which was first used by Marines in combat in 1918. The Browning automatic rifle gave the BAR man a great deal of firepower. It was like carrying a machine gun around with him. And the US military would keep on using Browning automatic rifles in combat for another 50 years. So, but the big thing that led to the German eventual defeat was attrition. That is, they had successfully cut off Germany from the outside world. And by the time you get to 1918, Germany's pretty much out of food. Right? They call the summer of 1917-18 in Germany, the winter of 1917-18, the turnip winter, because there was so little food in the country, the only thing available for civilians was turnips. Civilian rations in 1918 in Germany were down to 1,200 to 1,600 calories a day. Right? Basically meant that the German public was going hungry all the time. And by the fall of 1918, the German high command had concluded there was only about 6 months worth of food left in the entire country. So when their summer offensive failed and the Allies were successfully moving forward, the German military started negotiations with England, France, and America. These negotiations lead to an armistice that went into effect on November the 11th, 1918 at 11:11 in the morning. November 11th afterwards became Veterans Day. Actually, for up until World War II, it was called Armistice Day in the United States. After World War II, they'd call it Veterans Day because they didn't want to give World War II their own holiday, even though World War II is the war everybody likes. Right? So, what you get by November of 1918 is a victory by England and France and a defeat by Germany. And in the long run, what does that mean for the world? Absolutely nothing. Because remember what the Germans were fighting for. Let's see if we can go back to my map over here. The Germans started the war hoping that they could create a customs union that would have Western Europe in it, and hoping that they could basically colonize Eastern Europe. They lost. So if you go to Europe, what do you see today? You see something called the European Union. The European Union has within it a customs union, but more than that, it has also a free market, meaning that if you make something anywhere in Europe, you can move it anywhere in Europe. There's a total freedom of movement of people. This European Union is completely dominated by Germany. Germany is the biggest economy in it. Germany buys the bulk of the resources from it. Germany is full of factories that export products. Their export market is the rest of the European Union. Right? So if by Germany losing the war, they wound up with exactly the same Europe they would have gotten if they'd have won the war. Right? So basically, World War I was a total goddamn waste of time. It did not change the trajectory of the world a lot. However, World War I is ultimately going to become one of the most important events of world history. I would argue the most important event of the 20th century. And this is because of the unintended consequences of the war. What do I mean by unintended consequences? Well, you're going to wind up with a world that emerges from the war demoralized. They had believed that they were on the right track before the war started, that the world was getting better every day. But the war shattered this image. That is, you were in England, you were in France, you were in Germany. You thought that you had the greatest society in the history of the world. That is, that all of the world had led to you. And what had this greatest society in the history of the world accomplished? Oops, let me go backwards here. Well, the greatest society in the history of the world accomplished this, and 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 this. That is, they had started a war that killed 19 million people, right? Where the nations of the world were deliberately sending men to kill other men in the hopes that they would just kill more men than they had killed themselves. They had no bigger purpose than that. Where the result of the war basically made no difference in the world. This is going to completely disillusion the world. It is going to mean that the old values of the past are no longer going to be respected. Right? There's going to be a great wave of cynicism that is going to sweep the world after the war. And you're going to see the world changing as a result. That is, people who are disillusioned by the war are going to want a different future. And the competing visions of the future is something we're going to cover in the next class. Also, this war is going to cost a lot of money. The economic consequences of that are going to be tremendous. And we're going to cover that in your next topic. And this war is not going to resolve any of the underlying issues that led to it. That is, the forces of imperialism are still there. So within a generation, you're going to see a sequel, World War II, which, like most sequels, was bigger, better, and had better special effects than the first one. And we will pick up on all of that in the next series of classes that I will put up in the near future. But for now, this is World War I, so let me sign off.